She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the doorway of her husband's private room, 7 months pregnant, and she watched. Every face, every word, every lie still hanging in the air like smoke. Adrian Voss had built an empire on the belief that no one could touch him. Not rivals, not enemies, not the law. But in that moment, the woman he thought he knew best became the most dangerous person in the room. He just didn't know it yet. And by the time he did, it would already be too late. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The storm had been building all evening. Elena Marcelli Voss felt it before she saw it. That particular pressure behind the eyes, the kind that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with instinct. She'd learned to trust that feeling over 6 years of marriage to Adrian Voss. It had kept her alive, or close enough to it, in a world where women like her were expected to be beautiful and quiet and grateful. Tonight she was none of those things. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse's main living room, one hand pressed lightly against the curve of her stomach. 31 weeks, the baby kicking with a rhythm that felt almost impatient, like the child already knew what was coming. And she watched the city below swallow itself in rain. Neon signs blurred through the glass. Headlights streaked like tracer fire. Somewhere down on Mercer Street, a horn laid on itself for a long, pointless moment, then went silent. The penthouse was quiet in the way expensive things always were. Thick carpet, insulated glass, art on the walls that cost more than most people's houses, and communicated nothing except that the owner had money and wanted you to feel it. 6,000 square feet of curated silence, and somewhere in the back of it, behind a set of double doors that Elena had been told, gently, then less gently, to consider off-limits, her husband was having a meeting. That was the word he used. Meeting. She'd believed it the first dozen times. She crossed the room slowly. Her back had been aching since noon, a low, persistent pull that her doctor said was normal, but that felt like her body trying to warn her about something the medical establishment hadn't caught up to yet. She moved past the kitchen island, past the bar cart with its precisely arranged bottles, past the framed photograph on the side table. Her and Adrian on the Amalfi Coast 3 years ago, both of them laughing at something she couldn't remember now. And she stopped outside the corridor that led to his private study. She could hear voices. Not the voices of a business meeting. She knew what those sounded like, clipped, transactional, occasionally threatening in that low-register way that powerful men used when they wanted to remind each other of consequences without saying anything directly incriminating. She'd overheard enough of those in 6 years to parse the rhythm of them in her sleep. This was different. A woman's laugh, low, deliberate. The kind of laugh that wasn't really about finding something funny. Elena's hand flattened against her stomach. She moved down the corridor without thinking about it, the carpet absorbing her footsteps, the ache in her back suddenly distant. She reached the study doors, heavy mahogany, reinforced, the same doors that had stayed closed through every conversation she'd ever tried to have about the parts of Adrian's life he wouldn't share. And she found them open. Not all the way. Enough. A 3-inch gap. A sliver of amber light from the desk lamp. And through it, visible in segments like a photograph cut apart and rearranged, the scene that would divide her life cleanly into before and after. Adrian sat on the edge of his desk. Not behind it. On it, one leg bent, the posture of a man completely at ease in his own space. He wore the charcoal dress shirt she'd ironed 2 days ago, the cuffs rolled to the forearm, the collar open. She'd ironed that shirt. She'd pressed the creases flat with her own hands. The woman standing between his knees was not someone Elena recognized, but she recognized the type. Late 20s, dark-haired, wearing the kind of deliberately understated clothing that took real money to pull off. One hand rested on Adrian's chest. His hand covered hers. He was talking. His voice, in this room, with this woman, had a softness to it that Elena had not heard from him in. She ran the calendar back in her head and felt the number land like something falling from a great height. 2 years. She didn't move. This was the moment, she understood distantly, when she was supposed to push the door open, supposed to say something, do something, let the scene collapse into its inevitable humiliation and confrontation. That was what the story called for. The betrayed wife bursting in, voice cracking, hands shaking, the whole terrible theater of it. Instead, she stood in the gap and she looked. She looked at the woman's hand on Adrian's chest, and the way Adrian didn't flinch from it. She looked at the document spread open on the desk behind him. And this was the thing that cut through the shock before the grief even had time to form, because she recognized the header on those documents. She'd seen that letterhead before. Romano Holdings. She'd heard that name in exactly one context, spoken in exactly one tone, and that tone was the specific quiet that her husband used when he was genuinely afraid. Romano Holdings was Carlo Manchetti's front company. Carlo Manchetti, who was not Adrian's business partner. Carlo Manchetti, who was the closest thing to a rival Adrian had, the man who controlled the Eastern distribution network, the man whose name Adrian spoke maybe 4 times a year, and each time with the particular careful neutrality of someone diffusing a device they weren't sure about. Elena's gaze moved from the documents to the woman's face, angled in 3/4 profile, enough to see the sharpness of it, the calculated composure. And something clicked into place with a precision that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with 6 years of paying very careful attention to a world that had assumed she wasn't watching. This was not an affair, or it was an affair. The physical reality of it was in front of her, undeniable. But it was not only an affair. The Romano Holdings documents on her husband's private desk, spread open for a woman Adrian should not have known, told a story that was considerably darker and more dangerous than infidelity. She stepped back from the door. Slowly. One foot, then the other, heel to toe on the carpet, making no sound. She retreated down the corridor the same way she'd come, and she did not breathe normally until she reached the living room and put the full length of it between herself and that hallway. Then she sat down on the couch. She sat there for a long time, one hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move, and she let herself take stock of what she'd just seen the way she might take stock of an injury, methodically, without panic, assessing the full extent of the damage before deciding how to move. Her name was Elena Marcelli before she became Elena Voss, and she had not been nothing before that. Her father, Dominic Marcelli, had run a mid-level operation out of the Port Lawrence dockyards for the better part of 2 decades before a cardiac event took him when Elena was 22. She'd grown up at his table, literally at it, doing homework in the corner of the room, while men her father trusted spoke about things they assumed she was too young or too female to absorb. She'd been neither. She'd been cataloging. She'd been learning the grammar of this world the same way a child learns a first language, by immersion, by osmosis, by paying attention when everyone around you has decided you're not worth watching. Then she'd met Adrian Voss, and everything she was had contracted into the shape of what he needed her to be. And she had told herself that was a choice she was making freely. 6 years later, sitting alone in a penthouse while her husband had his hands on another woman and Romano Holdings documents sat open on his desk, she understood that the woman she'd been at 22, the one who cataloged and watched and remembered everything, had never actually left. She'd just been waiting. Elena looked at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, drank it, and stood at the sink for a moment looking at her own reflection in the darkened window above it. Tired eyes. A face she'd watched change over 6 years, softer in some places, harder in others, the way all faces changed when they spent a long time in proximity to power and violence, and the particular kind of loneliness that came from being the person everyone assumed was protected. She heard the study doors open, footsteps in the corridor. A murmur, Adrian's voice, quiet, dismissive, the sound of the private elevator at the far end of the hall, engaging, then descending. He came into the kitchen 40 seconds later, loosening his watch from his wrist, the gesture he always used as a kind of decompression after a long evening. He looked at her with the expression she'd grown up watching her father use, the one that was pleasant and attentive and revealed nothing. "You're still up," he said. "I couldn't sleep." She turns to face him. "The baby's been moving." He came to her, put his hand on her stomach the way he always did, and the baby, as if recognizing the touch, shifted. Elena watched his face do the thing it always did in these moments, the softening, the unguarded flicker of something real, and she filed it away along with everything else she'd collected tonight. "Go to bed," he said. "You need the rest." "I know," she said. "I'm going." She kissed him on the jaw. He turned into it slightly, habit, and walked past him toward the bedroom, and she did not let the rage show in her back, her shoulders, the set of her neck, for the full 30 feet of corridor it took to reach the bedroom door. She closed it quietly. She lay down on her side, her hand on the place where the baby was moving, and she began, methodically, without sentimentality, the way her father had taught her to approach a problem when emotion was a liability, to think. The name on the Romano Holdings documents had not been Carlo Manchetti's. That was the detail that had lodged in her brain, the splinter she kept returning to as the penthouse went quiet around her and Adrian's breathing deepened into sleep beside her sometime after 1 in the morning. She knew Manchetti's signature. She'd seen it once, on a document that had passed through her father's hands years ago, a sprawling, aggressive cursive that looked like it was trying to intimidate the page itself. The signature on the document she'd seen through the gap in the study door was different, smaller, controlled. The signature of someone who'd been trained to keep themselves contained. It was a name she'd heard Adrian mention exactly once, 8 months ago, in a phone call she'd overheard from the next room. He'd said it the way you'd say the name of a wound that had almost healed, carefully, like pressure on a bruise. Reeves. She didn't have a first name. She didn't have a face. She had a syllable and a signature in a front company that theoretically belonged to the most dangerous rival her husband had. And she had a woman she didn't recognize sitting in her husband's private study at midnight with documents that should not have existed anywhere near their penthouse. It was not enough, but it was a beginning. She lay still until the rhythm of Adrian's breathing told her he was fully under, and then she did something she hadn't done in 6 years of marriage. She got out of bed in the middle of the night, moved silently through the penthouse, and let herself into his study. The documents were gone. The desk was clear. He'd been careful, or she'd been meant to think he was careful, but she'd grown up watching her father work, and she knew the habits of men who believed in their own tidiness. She did not touch the desk. She stood in the center of the room, and she looked at everything from the middle of it, letting her eyes move the way her father had taught her, cataloging not what was there but what was missing, what was slightly wrong, what didn't sit the way it should. The leather portfolio on the left side of the desk. It was always there. Adrian used it for meeting notes, kept it closed, kept it under the desk lamp where he could reach it. Tonight it was on the wrong side. 6 inches to the left of where it usually sat, turned at a slightly different angle. He'd moved it. Or someone else had. She didn't open it. She memorized its position, its angle, the precise distance from the edge of the desk, and she left the room exactly as she'd found it, and she went back to bed, and she lay in the dark beside her sleeping husband. And she allowed herself for exactly 90 seconds to feel the grief of it, the full weight of 6 years and a child coming and a marriage she'd believed in, all of it cracking under the pressure of what she'd seen tonight. And then she closed that door inside herself and went to work. The next morning was a performance. Elena had always been a good actress. Living beside a man like Adrian Voss required it, not in the way people assumed, not the brittle performing of happiness over misery, but the more demanding kind of acting, the kind where you had to fully inhabit a version of yourself that was slightly less alert, slightly less observant, slightly less aware of every variable in the room, so that the man beside you never felt the particular unease that came from being with someone who saw more than you wanted them to. She made coffee. She ate the breakfast their housekeeper Marta left before anyone else arrived. She talked with Adrian over the kitchen island about the nursery they hadn't finished decorating, about the doctor's appointment scheduled for the following Thursday, about the fact that the crib they'd ordered still hadn't arrived and maybe they should call about it. Adrian ate and listened and said the appropriate things, and Elena watched him the way she'd learned to watch everything, from the inside of her own performance, from behind the face that was agreeable and tired and a little distracted, which was exactly how he expected a 31-week pregnant woman to look. He didn't ask where she'd been the night before when he'd come into the kitchen. He didn't ask how long she'd been up, what she'd been doing, whether she'd been near the hallway. This, she noted, man with nothing to hide might have asked. A man with something to hide and genuine confidence in his own concealment would not, because asking would imply the possibility of exposure. Adrian didn't ask. She filed that too. He left at 8:30 with Marco, his head of personal security, Marco Del Vecchio, broad and quiet and competent in the way that certain kinds of violence made men. And Elena stood at the window and watched the black SUV pull out of the underground garage and fold itself into the morning traffic, and then she turned around and she began. She went to the study. She opened the leather portfolio. The top sheet was meeting notes from 3 days ago. Real ones, she recognized the names, had overheard pieces of that conversation without knowing it had taken place. Below it, 2 pages of figures in Adrian's handwriting that she couldn't immediately interpret. Below that, a folded sheet on different paper, the weight and texture of it slightly off from everything else in the folder, the way something recently inserted sits differently from things that have been there for a while. She unfolded it. It was a property transfer document. Dry, technical, the language of legal instruments, but she'd grown up reading documents like this at her father's table, and she spoke this language. The property in question was a warehouse facility in the Kessler Industrial District, transferred from a holding entity called Voss Capital, LLC, Adrian's, to a receiving entity called Meridian Consolidated. The date on the document was 4 months ago. Elena had never heard of Meridian Consolidated, but the registered agent listed on the document, the person responsible for the receiving entity, was a name she didn't need to look up. D. Reeves. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were completely steady. She photographed the document with her phone, refolded it along its exact original creases, replaced it beneath the pages she'd moved, closed the portfolio, and returned it to the position she'd memorized the night before. She stood in the center of the study for a moment, breathing, making sure she'd missed nothing, then walked out and closed the door. Then she sat down in the living room and she looked at the city through the glass, gray and wet and grinding away at itself in the morning, and she allowed herself to understand what she'd found. Her husband had transferred a significant piece of his physical infrastructure to someone connected to Carlo Manchetti's organization. He'd done it 4 months ago, while she was 20 weeks pregnant, while they were eating dinner together every night and discussing nursery colors and going to doctor's appointments and existing in the placid surface of their marriage. He'd done it quietly, without her knowledge, and the woman in his study last night, D. Reeves, the controlled signature, the Roman Holdings documents, the hand on his chest, was either the broker of that deal or the enforcer of it, or something else entirely, something Elena hadn't figured out yet. The affair might be real. It probably was. But it was not the point. The point was the transfer. The point was what you gave away, and to whom, and what they held over you once you had. She called her cousin Pia from a burner phone she kept in a box of old winter scarves in the back of the closet. She'd bought it 2 years ago, on a day when she'd felt, for no specific reason she could articulate, that she should have a line of communication that didn't run through Adrian's infrastructure. She'd never used it. She'd thought of it sometimes at night, the way you thought of an insurance policy you hoped would never become relevant. Pia Marcelli was 34, 9 years older than Elena, and she'd stayed in the life their fathers had built while Elena had married out of it. She ran a small accounting firm that did clean work for legitimate clients and less clean work for less legitimate ones, and she had the particular flat effect of someone who'd been processing other people's messes for long enough that very little surprised her. The call connected on the second ring. "It's me," Elena said. A beat. I hear you, Pia said. "Different number. Different phone. I need information." "Okay." Meridian Consolidated, registered agent D. Reeves. "I need to know who that is, what the company is, and what they've been doing in the last 6 months. I need to know their connection to Romano Holdings." The silence on the other end of the line was not surprise. It was Pia doing the math. "Elena," she said finally, "I know." "Does he know you know?" "No." Another silence. "How long do you need this by?" "As fast as you can get it without leaving a trail." 48 hours, Pia said. "Maybe less if the registration paperwork is public." "Thank you." She ended the call. She removed the battery from the burner. Old habit from watching her father, the kind of thing she'd absorbed at 12 without knowing she'd need it at 28. And she put both pieces back in the scarf box. And she went to the kitchen and started thinking about what she was going to do about the fact that she had 48 hours to wait, and a husband who was hiding something larger than an affair, and a baby coming in 9 weeks, and no clear picture yet of the specific shape of the danger she was walking into. Adrian came home at 6. He came home with flowers, which he didn't always do but did regularly enough that it hadn't always meant something. Tonight she looked at the flowers. White peonies, her favorite, and he knew that, had always known it. And she thought about what it meant to know someone's favorite flower and still do what he'd done. "How was your day?" he asked, setting the peonies on the counter, shrugging off his jacket. "Quiet," she said. "I read. Marta came to clean. I talked to Dr. Harmon's office about rescheduling Thursday. She wants to move it to the morning slot. That works? He was looking at her. She could feel it. The specific quality of his attention when he was checking something, taking a temperature, running a calculus. She'd felt that look many times and had always, before tonight, assumed it was the natural vigilance of a man who lived the way he lived. Now she understood it was something more targeted. You feeling all right? Tired, she said. My back. You should rest more. I know. She turned and put the peonies in the vase she kept on the counter, the glass one his mother had given them, which she had always found oppressive and had kept anyway because it was a useful marker. And she arranged them without hurrying. Marcus called, she added, because this was true, and because giving him a real piece of information created the texture of normalcy. About the dinner Friday. I told him we'd confirm by tomorrow. We'll go, Adrian said. It's fine. He moved behind her toward the bar cart. She heard the quiet knock of ice in a glass. The particular 3 beats of his pour. She'd been watching her husband make drinks for 6 years, and she knew the exact sound of a man trying to decompress from something he wasn't going to tell her about. Adrian, she said it to the flowers, her back still to him, finishing the arrangement. Did anything unusual happen at the office today? She heard the pause. It was small, less than a second, but she'd built her adult life on reading the pauses of powerful men, and this one registered like a struck match in a dark room. Nothing worth talking about, he said. Luca's being difficult about the North End accounts. The usual. She said, and turned around and smiled at him the way she'd been smiling at men like him since she was old enough to know that she needed to, and she said, What do you want for dinner? He looked at her for one more moment, the check, the calibration, and then he relaxed. Whatever's easy, he said. I'm not hungry. Okay, she said. She made pasta. They ate at the kitchen island, talking about the baby, talking about whether they should call the crib company again, talking about Pia's daughter who'd just gotten into a university upstate and wasn't that good, and through all of it, Elena felt herself operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. The surface conversation and the calculation running beneath it, constant and cold and clear. And she understood something about herself that she'd almost forgotten. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. The woman who'd stopped being good at it was the woman who'd believed that being loved meant she didn't have to be. The call from Pia came 31 hours later. Elena was in the nursery, half-painted, the crib not yet arrived, a flat-pack changing table she'd assembled herself leaning against the far wall, when the burner vibrated in her pocket. Meridian consolidated, Pia said. Her voice had the careful flatness of someone reporting something they didn't enjoy knowing. It's a layered entity. 3 shells deep, but the structure underneath connects to a man named Daniel Reeves. He's not Carlo Manchetti's people. Elena waited. He's Hector Vane's. The name landed in the room like something physical. Elena sat down on the floor of the unfinished nursery, back against the wall, one hand on her stomach, and she let the implications of it expand outward from the center. Hector Vane did not run a rival organization in the conventional sense. He didn't have a territory, didn't have a distribution network, didn't have the kind of visible criminal infrastructure that other power structures in the city operated through. What he had was information. He was the man you went to if you wanted to know where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally, more often financially. He brokered leverage. He sold access. He connected people who needed to destroy each other to the specific tools required for the destruction. The Romano Holdings letterhead had been a misdirection. The affair, possibly, had been a misdirection. What was actually sitting on her husband's desk last night was a document connecting Adrian Voss to the one man in the city who made his money by knowing which version of a man's life could be used to dismantle the rest of it. And Adrian had signed something over to him 4 months ago. Voluntarily, or under pressure she didn't have the full picture of yet. Pia, she said quietly. I know, Pia said. Who else knows about this? I'm assuming the people who built the structure know. Otherwise, Pia paused. Elena, if Vane has something on Adrian significant enough to get a property transfer, that means Adrian did something that created the exposure. Something bad enough that he'd rather give up the warehouse than have it come out. Yes. Do you know what it is? Not yet. You need to know what it is before you decide what to do with this. Because if you move wrong, I know, Elena said. I know what happens if I move wrong. She thanked her cousin. She took the battery out of the phone. She sat on the floor of the nursery for another 5 minutes, her hand flat on her stomach, the baby quiet for once, and she looked at the half-painted wall across from her. Soft gray-green, she'd chosen it herself, had argued gently for it against Adrian's preference for something more neutral. And she thought about the warehouse in the Kessler Industrial District, and what you could store in a warehouse, and what kind of information would be worth a property transfer to keep contained. And she thought about the woman in the study with her hand on her husband's chest, and the Romano Holdings letterhead that was Hector Vane's letterhead, and the controlled signature of Daniel Reeves, who was not Carlo Manchetti's person at all. She thought about her father, who had trusted the wrong person once, and had spent 4 years unwinding the consequences before the cardiac event finished the job. She thought about the baby, who was quiet now but who would be here in 9 weeks, would be a person in the world, would need someone who understood what world they were being born into. She stood up. She put the burner in her pocket. She walked to the window of the nursery and looked down at the street below. Ordinary evening, cars and pedestrians, and a delivery cyclist cutting through the intersection. And she felt the last remainder of the woman she'd been performing for 6 years dissolve into something older and colder and considerably more useful. Then she walked downstairs to find her husband, and she smiled at him the way she'd been practicing for 31 years. And she let him pull her into his arms and put his hands on her stomach and say something soft about the baby. And she felt his voice in his chest under her ear, and she let herself feel that, the reality of it, the warmth of it, the grief of it, for exactly the time it took him to say what he was saying. And then she started planning. She'd spent 6 years learning the shape of Adrian's empire, his allies, his exposed flanks, his loyalties and the specific hierarchy of them, which ones would hold under pressure, and which ones were conditional, and which ones he didn't know were already compromised. She'd absorbed all of it the way she'd absorbed everything in her life. From the margin, from the corner of the room, from the posture of someone who wasn't paying close attention. She knew where the pressure points were. She knew which names connected to which vulnerabilities. She knew the warehouse in the Kessler district wasn't the only thing Hector Vane had positioned himself to control. She knew, because she'd overheard it 18 months ago and filed it away as information she'd probably never need, about the shipping accounts, about the name of the man who managed them, about the specific bank that held the instruments. She had not known, 18 months ago, why she was filing any of this. She knew now. The betrayal in the study had cracked something open, but what it had cracked open was not her life. It was her restraint. Adrian felt her breathe against his chest, and he kissed the top of her head and he said, "You're quiet." "I'm thinking about the nursery," she said. "We'll finish it this weekend," he said. "I promise." "I know," she said. And she tipped her head back to look at his face, this face she'd looked at for 6 years, this face that was still, in the specific way that complicated things, a face she recognized and felt something real about. And she held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that something shifted in his expression, something uncertain moved across it, and was gone before he could identify it. "Elena," he said. "Hmm?" He looked at her for another beat, searching for whatever had moved through her eyes, not finding it. "Nothing," he said. "Just—" He exhaled. "I love you." She put her hand on his jaw. She looked at him the way she'd learned to look at things she needed to understand completely before she dismantled them. "I know," she said. Upstairs in the nursery, the half-painted wall waited. The unassembled furniture waited. The space where the crib would eventually stand waited. Somewhere in the city, in an office Elena had not yet found but would, Hector Vane was building something with her husband's name on it, and the woman who'd been standing quietly in the margin of a dangerous world for 6 years was finally, with 9 weeks left before her child arrived, beginning to move. She just needed to find the thing that Adrian had done, the original exposure, the wound that Vane had his hand in. She needed to find it before Vane decided he had enough leverage to stop needing Adrian's cooperation and start simply using what he had, because a man like Hector Vane didn't build leverage to hold indefinitely. He built it to use. And when he used it, everyone in Adrian's orbit would be standing in the blast radius, including her, including the child she was 9 weeks from delivering into a world that was already arranging itself around them both like a trap. She stepped back from her husband. She squeezed his hand once. "I'm going to bed early," she said. "Come up when you're ready." She walked up the stairs with her back straight and her face neutral, and the names and dates and figures she'd been collecting for 31 hours moving in precise formation through her mind, and she did not look back. Behind her, Adrian Voss stood alone in the living room of his penthouse and watched his wife walk away from him, and for the first time in their marriage he felt something he didn't have a name for, a pull at the edge of his awareness, a sense that the ground beneath a thing he'd trusted absolutely had developed a fault line he hadn't been watching for. He stood there for a long time after she was gone. In the morning he would tell himself he'd imagined it, that she was tired, that she was pregnant, that the unease he'd felt was his own conscience manufacturing signals in the dark. He would be wrong. But by the time he understood how wrong, Elena would already be 3 moves ahead of him, and the clock, which neither of them could hear yet, had already started counting down. The morning after Adrian told her he loved her, Elena woke at 5:15 and lay in the gray dark listening to him breathe. He slept on his back, one arm across his chest, the way he always did when something was working on him beneath the surface. She'd cataloged his sleep the way she'd cataloged everything else. Not obsessively, not with intent, just the passive accumulation of years of paying attention to a person in their most unguarded state. When Adrian slept flat on his back with his jaw tight, something in his waking life was unresolved. She'd noticed it first 18 months into their marriage and had asked him about it once, lightly, over breakfast. He'd smiled and said she was imagining things. She watched the ceiling and thought about Hector Vane and about the warehouse and about the specific quality of the lie Adrian had told her at dinner. Luca's being difficult about the North End accounts, the usual. The way it had that particular smoothness of a prepared line, rehearsed without being rehearsed, which was the hardest kind of lie to produce and the kind Adrian was very good at. She'd been married to it for 6 years. She got up at 5:40, dressed without turning on the bedroom light, and went to the kitchen. Marta didn't arrive until 8. The penthouse in those early hours was a different place. The city light coming through the glass flat and gray. The silence actual rather than managed. The whole curated stillness of the place stripped of the performance it required during daylight. Elena made coffee and stood at the window and drank it and thought about what she needed and what she didn't have yet, and how long she had before the shape of whatever Vane was building became visible enough to act on. The warehouse transfer was 4 months ago. The woman, Daniel Reeves, had been in the study 3 nights ago, which meant whatever the arrangement was, it was active, not dormant, which meant the clock she'd imagined was not imagination. She needed the original exposure, the thing Adrian had done that Vane had gotten his hands on. She knew, because she'd watched her father operate for 22 years, that a man like Vane didn't acquire leverage accidentally. Leverage was discovered or it was manufactured. If it was discovered, that meant Adrian had made an error somewhere, something documented, something witnessed, something that had left a trail Vane had followed. If it was manufactured, that was a different problem entirely, because manufactured leverage implied that someone inside Adrian's own organization had been feeding information outward. She put down her coffee cup. Both possibilities led to the same question: who was Daniel Reeves, specifically, and how had he gotten close enough to Adrian to be sitting in his study with Romano Holdings documents at midnight? She called Pia at 7:30 from the burner, standing in the nursery with the door closed. "I need the rest of it," she said. "Good morning to you too," Pia said. The flat effect, the lack of surprise. "What rest?" "Daniel Reeves. Not the company structure, the person. Where does he come from? How does he operate? And what's his specific function inside Vane's network?" She heard Pia exhale. Not impatience, something more careful than that. "Elena, what I gave you the first time was public record and a few calls I can explain if someone asks. What you're asking for now is going to require me to talk to people. Then talk to them. And if someone connects those conversations back to, I know the risk," Elena said. "I'm asking you to take it." A long pause. 24 hours. "Thank you." She ended the call and sat down on the floor with her back against the nursery wall and let herself breathe for a moment. Really breathe, the slow, deliberate kind, the kind her doctor had taught her in the second trimester for managing the anxiety spikes that came with late pregnancy, and that Elena had been using instead for the management of information she couldn't act on yet. 32 weeks, 7 weeks until her due date, give or take. She'd already had the conversation with Dr. Harmon about what early labor looked like, what the indicators were, when to call. She'd been the kind of patient who asked the right questions because she'd grown up in a world where not asking the right questions had consequences. 7 weeks. She looked at the half-painted wall and thought it would be enough. Adrian left at 8 with Marco and came back at noon, which was unusual. He didn't come back at noon. He had lunch meetings, working lunches, food delivered to the office. He didn't come home midday. Elena was sitting at the kitchen island with a book she wasn't reading when she heard the elevator, and she placed the book down and adjusted her expression to something neutral and tired before he cleared the doorway. He looked wrong. Not dramatically. Adrian was too controlled for dramatic, but she'd spent 6 years reading the micro-expressions of a man who showed nothing, and something in the set of his mouth, the slightly compressed quality of the way he crossed the room, told her that something had happened between 8 and noon that he was currently processing. "You're home early," she said. Meeting canceled. He went to the refrigerator, opened it, stood looking into it without taking anything. "How are you feeling?" "Fine. The baby's been quiet today." She watched him close the refrigerator without having taken anything. "Adrian." He turned. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you've been standing in the cold." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, something more complicated. And then he came and sat at the island across from her, and she saw the thing she'd noticed last night again. That uncertainty, that fractional hesitation before settling his weight, as if the ground he was putting it on was less solid than it had been. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing happened." "Okay." "It's work. It's—" He stopped, looked at her. The checking the temperature look, but different now, less confident in what it was taking the temperature of. "Luca quit this morning." Elena kept her face still. "Quit." "Walked out. No notice, no explanation. Just—" He made a gesture with his hand, a flat dismissal. "Gone." Luca Ferrante. Adrian's financial director for 7 years, the man who managed the accounts Elena had heard referred to, obliquely and over time, as the architecture of the operation. The legitimate holdings, the shell structures, the instruments that kept the visible portion of the empire looking like the thing it was supposed to look like. Luca Ferrante, who had access to everything. "That's strange," Elena said. Her voice was level. Her hands, under the island, were pressed flat against her thighs. "He's been distracted for months," Adrian said. "I should have seen it." She nodded slowly, as if thinking about it. "Did he say anything before he left?" "No." Adrian's jaw was tight. "Marco's looking into it." "I'm sure it'll be fine," she said. "People quit." He looked at her for a long moment, the look harder to read now than it used to be. "Yeah," he said finally, "but the people quit." He stayed for 40 minutes. He made a call from the living room in a voice too low for her to catch the words. He came back, kissed her on the top of the head in the absent way of a man thinking about 3 things at once, and left. Elena sat at the kitchen island for a long time after the elevator closed. Luca Ferrante had not quit. She didn't know this as fact. She had no evidence, only the logic of what she knew and the way it assembled itself. But the timing was not coincidence. The warehouse transfer was 4 months ago. The woman in the study, 3 nights ago. And now the financial director who knew the architecture of everything had simply walked out the door. Either he'd been extracted, pulled out of Adrian's operation by someone who now had more use for him elsewhere, or he'd run, because he knew something was coming and he wanted distance from it before it arrived. Either way, it meant the timeline was shorter than she'd thought. The fight happened that evening. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't needed to. Adrian came home at 7, and he was different from the man who'd left at noon. There'd been more calls, she could tell by the particular exhaustion that phone calls produced in him, a tension at the temples, a flatness in the eyes. He came in and dropped his jacket on the chair. He never dropped his jacket. He always hung it. It was one of the compulsions she'd mapped years ago. And poured a drink and stood with his back to her at the bar cart. "Dinner's in the oven," she said. 20 minutes. "I'm not hungry." "You said that last night." "Then I wasn't hungry last night either." She let a beat pass. "Adrian." "Elena." He said it without turning. Warning, not affection. "Something's wrong. I told you. Work." "You told me Luca quit. That's not nothing. He's been with you for 7 years." Now he turned, the drink in his hand, the controlled stillness that he used as a wall. I'm handling it. I know you're handling it. I'm not questioning whether you can handle it. I'm asking you to tell me what it is. That's not... He stopped. Not what? Not my business? She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in the last 24 hours. Not the words, but the register. Where to push. Where to stay still. How to generate information by creating pressure without making him feel cornered enough to close off entirely. I'm your wife. I'm having your child. If something is threatening this family, nothing is threatening this family. Then why do you look like that? He set the glass down. Hard, but controlled. Like what? Like you're calculating. He looked at her. The full look. No deflection. No temperature check quality to it. Just the direct weight of it. And for a moment she thought she'd pushed too hard, had cracked the performance before she was ready. I always calculate, he said. That's why we have all of this. The gesture was minimal, just a movement of his head, encompassing the penthouse, the city through the glass, all of it. That's why you've been comfortable for 6 years. It was a small cruelty, calibrated. She felt it land, but she didn't let it register on her face. I know that, she said quietly. Then let me handle my business. I'm not trying to... Elena. He crossed the room to her. He put his hands on her shoulders, and she let him, and she looked up at his face and she watched him decide to be kind again, which was its own kind of thing to observe. I need you to trust me. She held his gaze. I do trust you, she said. He exhaled, some of the tension releasing. His hands moved from her shoulders to her face, briefly, a gesture that was genuine. She knew the difference, had mapped it. And then he stepped back and picked up his drink and went to the living room, and Elena turned back to the oven, and she stood there with her hands on the counter and her eyes closed for a count of 3, then 4, then 5. I need you to trust me. She'd trusted him. She'd trusted him specifically enough to believe that the version of their marriage she was living in was the real one. She'd been wrong about that, and the wrongness of it wasn't just personal, it was strategic. She'd had all the information she needed, moving through this space for years, and she'd looked at it through the lens of a woman who wanted to believe, and that lens had cost her. She wasn't going to look through it anymore. Pia's call came at 11:17 the next morning. Elena was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, the burner already in her hand because she'd felt the day building towards something since 6 a.m., and she'd learned to trust that feeling. Daniel Reeves, Pia said. She sounded different, more careful, the flat effect compressed into something quieter and more deliberate. Real name David Reyes, 41. He worked for Vane directly for 3 years, then moved into a semi-autonomous role about 18 months ago. He specializes in structured exits. Elena waited. That's the term. Structured exits. He goes into an organization, identifies the load-bearing elements, the financial architecture, the personnel dependencies, and he builds an extraction framework. He doesn't steal, he repositions. He does it slowly enough that by the time the organization understands what happened, the foundation is already somewhere else. The silence in the room was complete. The woman, Elena said. What? The woman I saw with Adrian, is she connected to Reeves? A pause. Possibly. Vane uses a small number of people who move between operations. I don't have a name for her yet. Keep looking. Elena. Pia's voice shifted. What I just told you. Structured exits, Reeves, the warehouse transfer. That's not a man who got caught with something and is paying to keep it quiet. That's an operation. Someone decided to dismantle Adrian's organization from the inside out, and they are well into the process. Luca Ferrante was extracted, Elena said. Yes, I think so. His wife's family has a property in Castellan province. He's not coming back. Elena pressed her free hand flat against her stomach. The baby was awake, moving in small, purposeful rolls, and she focused on that for a half-second, the specific warmth of it, the reality of it. And then she refocused. Who commissioned it? She said. It was not a question. I don't know yet. Best guess? Elena? Pia. Best guess. A long exhale. Someone who wants the entire territory. Not the money, not the infrastructure, the territory. The distribution access, the port relationships, the name. Someone who can absorb all of it once the current structure collapses. Pia paused. There are 3 families in this city who benefit from a vacuum where Adrian Voss used to be. Tell me the names, Pia told her. Elena sat with those names for a moment. 2 of them she'd expected. The third one she had not, and the third one was the one that hit her like cold water because she knew it. She'd sat at dinner with that name. She'd shaken hands with it, smiled at it across tables at events Adrian had brought her to, accepted a wedding gift from it 5 years ago that was still in their storage unit 3 floors down. You're sure, she said. I'm not sure of anything, Pia said, but the structure of it fits. The timeline fits. And she stopped. Say it. The property that Reeves received in the transfer. The Kessler warehouse. Elena, that property has a specific history. It was used 4 years ago, before you would have known about it, for something that your husband cannot have documented. If Vane found documentation that shouldn't exist and gave it to Reeves to hold, then Adrian signed the transfer to keep it buried. Yes. What was it? A pause longer than the others. I don't know. But whatever it was bad enough for Adrian Voss to give up physical infrastructure to contain it. And now Reeves holds the infrastructure and presumably the documentation. Elena stood up. She moved to the window, looked out at the city, and she thought about a man who'd built an empire on control and the specific irony of that control being used to dismantle him. One more thing, Pia said. Tell me. Reeves is moving faster. Whoever commissioned this is accelerating the timeline. I don't know what the trigger was, but something in the last 2 weeks has pushed them to move quicker. A beat. If the structured exit completes before Adrian understands what's happening, Elena, there won't be an organization to save. There'll just be a lot of dangerous people who need someone to blame for the collapse. And your husband is the obvious. I understand, Elena said. You need to tell him. Not yet. Elena, I can't tell him yet. If I tell him what I know, he'll want to know how I know it. And the moment he starts trying to contain my involvement is the moment I lose access to everything I've been building. I need 3 more days. The silence on Pia's end had a specific quality to it. Not agreement, not disagreement, just the careful quiet of a woman who knew better than to argue with the decision that had already been made. 3 days, Pia said finally. And then you tell him. 3 days, Elena agreed. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the city move below her, the ordinary traffic of it, the people who walked through a world that was operating at its usual pitch of ordinary danger and had no idea that somewhere in the structure above them, a quiet and methodical demolition had been underway for months. She thought about the name Pia had given her, the third one, the one she hadn't expected, the one she'd shaken hands with, the one whose wedding gift was in her storage unit. She thought about the dinner on Friday, the one Adrian had agreed to attend. Marcus's dinner. Marcus Hale, Adrian's oldest friend in the city, the man who'd stood at their wedding and toasted their future in a voice that had sounded, at the time, like genuine warmth. Marcus Hale was one of the 3 names. She turned from the window. She pulled the burner apart, battery and shell, and put both pieces in her pocket. She went to the closet and retrieved the small box where she kept the documents she'd photographed, printed, not stored on any device connected to the penthouse's network. And she sat on the bedroom floor with them spread around her, and she began to build the shape of what she actually knew versus what she suspected versus what she could prove. The affair, real or manufactured proximity, she still didn't know. The warehouse transfer, documented, photographed, real. Luca Ferrante's departure, real, probable extraction. David Reyes, structured exit specialist, real, active. The third name, the oldest friend. The man coming to dinner on Friday with his wife and his easy laugh, and the specific warmth that Elena now understood had been, for at least the last several months, a performance not unlike her own. She looked at the documents around her. 33 weeks pregnant, sitting on the floor of her bedroom in a penthouse that had begun to feel less like a home and more like a crime scene she was responsible for processing, and she understood with a cold clarity that had no drama in it at all, that the thing she'd been building, the picture, the information, the shape of what was happening, was about to collide with reality in a way that would not give her the option of moving carefully. Friday was 3 days away. At Friday's dinner, in a room full of people who assumed she was the least dangerous person present, Marcus Hale was going to sit across from the man he was orchestrating the destruction of and eat his food and drink his wine and look Elena in the eyes, and she was going to let him. She gathered the documents, squared them, slid them back into the box. She put the box behind the winter clothes in the closet, behind the scarves where the burner lived, the deep back of the shelf where Marta didn't clean. She stood, slowly, one hand on the closet door frame, and she looked at her reflection in the mirror on the back of the closet door. 33 weeks, the weight of it visible in her face now, the tiredness real even through the performance of it. And she said quietly, to the woman looking back at her, 3 days. Then she heard the elevator engage. Adrian, home earlier than expected again. 2 days in a row. The organization compressing around him as pieces were removed, the man at the center of it beginning, even if he didn't know it yet, to feel the reduction of the space he had to operate in. She closed the closet door. She smoothed her shirt. She walked to the bedroom door, opened it, and went to meet her husband with an expression of mild and ordinary pleasure at his early return. And behind that expression, moving in careful formation, was everything she'd assembled in the last 72 hours. The names, the timeline, the shape of the thing, the one she hadn't expected, and the absolute certainty that in 3 days, at Marcus Hale's dinner table, the war that had been running silently through the architecture of her marriage was going to break into the open. And this time, when it did, she was not going to be standing in a doorway watching. The dinner was at Marcus Hale's townhouse on Ellery Street, the kind of address that announced itself quietly. No gates, no obvious security, just a narrow 4-story brownstone in a neighborhood where the money was old enough to be embarrassed by display. Elena dressed carefully. Not the way she usually dressed for these events, the soft colors, the careful understatement of a woman who understood that her role was to complement rather than compete. Tonight she wore dark charcoal, a wrap dress that accommodated her stomach without apology, and she did her own makeup at the bathroom mirror while Adrian knotted his tie behind her, and she watched his reflection without appearing to watch it, cataloging the tension in his jaw, the slight compression around his eyes that had been there for 3 days and hadn't released. He was scared. He didn't know what of yet, but the body knew before the mind caught up, and Adrian's body had been running a low-grade alarm for 72 hours. "You look good," he said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Thank you," she said. She meant, "I know exactly what I'm walking into tonight, and so do you, and only one of us knows that the other one knows." He straightened his tie. "Ready?" "Almost." She applied the last of her lipstick, a dark rose, deliberate, the color of something that would leave a mark, and capped the tube and set it on the counter with a precision that had nothing to do with lipstick. "Now I'm ready." There were 8 of them at the table. Marcus and his wife Diane, who was warm and oblivious and had spent the last 3 years renovating a farmhouse upstate and wanted to talk about it. 2 other couples Elena recognized from the circuit of these dinners. Thomas Wren, who ran legitimate real estate and kept his connection to Adrian's world deliberately vague, and his wife, and a man named Castellano, who imported wine, and whose specific function in the larger architecture Elena had never fully mapped. And then Adrian. And then Elena. She sat across from Marcus. She'd been doing it for 5 years at these dinners, this exact configuration, and she'd spent all 5 of those years behaving exactly as she was expected to. Engaged, pleasant, asking about the farmhouse, and the wine, and the renovation, and contributing the kind of conversation that made the evening flow smoothly and left no impression. Tonight she watched Marcus Hale eat his soup, and she thought about the warehouse in the Kessler district and the name that Pia had given her and the wedding gift in the storage unit, and she smiled at something Diane said about reclaimed wood flooring, and she waited. Marcus was good. She gave him that. 52 years old, the broad, easy physicality of a man who'd played sports in college, and kept enough of it to carry authority in a room. Gray at the temples. A laugh that opened his whole face and felt genuine even when, she now understood, it absolutely was not. He'd spent 30 years building the specific social infrastructure of a man who was trusted, and he wore it the way you wore a coat you'd owned so long it had taken the shape of your body. He looked at her twice during the soup course. Normal attention, just the ordinary eye contact of a dinner table. The third time, during the second course, he held it a half-second longer than in the second course. He held it a half-second longer than necessary, and she held it back. And something passed between them that was not identifiable as anything specific, but that she filed with the precision of someone who filed everything. He knew she was looking at him differently. He didn't know why yet. Adrian was 2 seats to her left, and she tracked him in her peripheral vision, the way he laughed at Marcus's story about a deal that had gone sideways in the spring, the way the laugh didn't reach his eyes, the way he drank his wine slightly faster than he usually did at these things, refilling twice before the main course arrived. The main course was rack of lamb. The conversation moved to the city's new development project on the harbor, and Thomas Wren had opinions about it, and Marcus listened to those opinions with the attentive patience of a man performing interest, and Elena ate her food and said very little and watched the table. She was waiting for the moment, the specific moment she'd identified in advance, when Marcus would manufacture a reason to separate Adrian from the group. It came over dessert. A comment, casual, about a property issue on the east side that required 5 minutes of Adrian's attention, something to do with the Castellano arrangement. Would he mind stepping into the study for a moment? Adrian agreed the way he always agreed to Marcus's requests, and Diane covered the gap in conversation by pivoting to the farmhouse again, and Elena counted to 30 after they left the room and then excused herself to find the bathroom. She did not go to the bathroom. The townhouse's study was on the 2nd floor, which she knew because she'd been in it twice before, both times to retrieve Adrian from conversations that had run long. The staircase was to the left of the dining room door. She took it slowly. The pregnancy made slowness easy to explain if she encountered anyone, and she reached the 2nd floor landing and stood outside the study door. Closed, but not thick enough. She pressed herself against the wall beside it, her shoulder 3 inches from the frame, and she listened. Can't hold him off much longer. Marcus's voice, the easy warmth of it gone, something harder underneath. Reeves is asking for the portside accounts by end of next week. I told you. Adrian's voice, controlled but frayed at the edge in a way she recognized. I need more time to move those without triggering the oversight mechanism. If I pull them too fast... Adrian, Marcus, cutting across him. He doesn't care about your mechanism. He needs the accounts, or the documentation goes to the investigative unit. You understand what that means. A silence. You said you had it handled, Adrian said. The fraying more pronounced now. You said Reeves was a short-term arrangement. 60 days, you said. It's been 4 months. Arrangements evolve. That's not an answer, Marcus. It's the only answer I have. A sound. A glass being set down. The specific click of crystal on a hard surface. You should have thought about the documentation 4 years ago. You didn't. Now we manage it. The silence this time was longer. Elena pressed her shoulder blade against the wall and breathed through her nose, slow and shallow, and she felt the baby shift. A long, slow roll, as if responding to the elevation in her heart rate, and she put her hand flat against her stomach and held it there. What does he want after the portside accounts? Adrian said. His voice was flat now. The flatness she associated with him making a calculation he didn't like. The North Corridor relationships, Marcus said. Delgado's people. And after that, a pause. He'll want the Marcelli port contacts. The temperature in Elena's body dropped several degrees. The Marcelli port contacts, her father's contacts, the network that Dominic Marcelli had built over 2 decades at the Port Lawrence dockyards, and that had passed when Dominic died, not to his organization, which had dissolved, but to Elena, in the form of 3 names written in her father's handwriting on a piece of paper she kept in a book at the back of her closet. 3 names who, to this day, took her calls because she was Dominic's daughter, and in this world that meant something, and who she had never used because she had chosen, or believed she'd chosen, a different life. Vane didn't just want Adrian's organization. He wanted hers, or rather, he'd always known about hers. And the affair, the woman, Reeves, had never been primarily about Adrian at all. It had been about proximity to Elena, to the inheritance she hadn't known anyone outside her family was aware she held. She stood in the hallway outside her oldest friend's study, her husband's oldest friend, she corrected, and she understood, with the specific sickness of a complete recalculation, that she had been wrong about the target from the beginning. She'd been looking at the structure of a demolition aimed at Adrian, and she'd missed the foundation it was actually aimed at, which was her. She moved back from the door. She went to the bathroom at the end of the hall, ran the cold water, and pressed her wrist under it and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. The dark charcoal dress, the dark rose lipstick, The face of a woman who had thought she was 3 moves ahead and had just discovered she'd been looking at the wrong board. 3 names on a piece of paper in a book in her closet. If Vane got those names, if he got the port access that went with them, he didn't need Adrian's organization at all. He didn't need the structured exit, the accounts, the portside transfers. The port relationships were the thing. They always had been. The reason Dominic Marcelli had been worth knowing, the reason Adrian had married his daughter, the reason, and this was the new thought, the one that came in cold and sat down heavily in the center of everything she'd constructed, the reason Adrian had chosen her. She turned off the water. She walked back downstairs and sat down at the table and smiled at Diane's question about the farmhouse's original kitchen fixtures. And she drank her water, and she felt the evening continue around her, and she sat inside a complete and utter silence and thought about the piece of paper in the book in the closet. The drive home was quiet. Adrian sat beside her in the back of the SUV with his eyes on the window and his jaw in the position she'd identified as active suppression, processing something he wasn't ready to speak yet. She let the quiet sit. She looked at the city moving past the glass, and she thought about what she'd heard in the study, and she began, with the cold precision that had been available to her for 33 years, and that she'd spent 6 of them deliberately not using, to revise everything. The marriage. The choice of her specifically, the years of careful distance from her father's world while her husband moved inside it, the way that distance had felt, at the time, like protection. It had been containment. She thought about her wedding day, Marcus's toast. To the 2 people who deserve each other most in this room, she'd found it moving. She found it something else now. "How are you feeling?" Adrian said without turning from the window. "Tired," she said. "It was a long evening." "Marcus says the farmhouse is going to take another year." Diane mentioned that. She paused. "He seemed distracted tonight." A fractional shift in the quality of Adrian's stillness. "Did he?" Just an impression." The SUV pulled into the underground garage. Marco got out first, opened Elena's door, and she took the offered hand and stepped out, the weight of the pregnancy shifting with the movement, and she waited for Adrian and walked beside him to the elevator. She needed to get to the closet before she slept. She needed to move those names somewhere else, not the penthouse, not anywhere connected to Adrian's life or hers as it currently existed. She needed to call Pia with what she'd heard, and she needed to think very carefully about what the revised picture meant for the 3 days she'd given herself, and whether 3 days was still even a relevant unit of measurement. The elevator opened into the penthouse. Marta had left the kitchen light on, the living room in comfortable dimness. Adrian went to the bar cart. Elena said she was going to change and went to the bedroom. She went straight to the closet. The book was a collection of short stories her father had given her when she was 19. Nothing that would look significant to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. She took it from the shelf, opened it to the back page, and she looked at the 3 names in her father's handwriting. She stood there looking at them for a long moment. Then she heard Adrian in the doorway of the bedroom. She closed the book. Not quickly. Too quickly would register. At the pace of someone who'd been idly looking at something and was now done with it. She replaced it on the shelf. She turned and he was standing in the doorway with his glass and his jacket off, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Not the checking expression, not the controlled flatness, not the distracted distance of the last 3 days. It was the expression of a man who had been deciding something and had just decided it. "We need to talk," he said. She felt her heart rate stay exactly where it was, and she was grateful for the 6 years that had made that possible. "Okay," she said. He came into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, not behind the distance of the room, but close, the drink on the nightstand, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention, the kind he usually reserved for threats, and he said, "What do you know?" Not a question, not entirely. She sat across from him on the small chair in the corner of the room, the one she read in, and she crossed her hands in her lap and she looked at him. "Know about what?" she said. "Don't." He said it quietly. "Elena, don't do the thing where you make me work for it. Not tonight." She looked at him. The gamble was real, and she felt it. How much to give, how much to hold, whether the calculation she'd been running was still the right one given what she'd overheard on the 2nd floor of Marcus Hale's townhouse. "I know about the warehouse transfer," she said, "to Meridian Consolidated. David Reyes, Vane's operation. He didn't move. I know Luca was extracted, not gone. I know Marcus is the one who introduced you to Reeves, or Reyes, or whatever name he's using. And I know... She paused. One breath. I know what Vane actually wants. Adrian put his hands on his knees and he looked at the floor. The posture was one she had never seen on him in 6 years. Something in the shoulders, a degree of deflation that his body had apparently been holding back for months. How long? He said. A week. He looked up. How? My father taught me to pay attention. Something moved across his face. Too many things at once to identify individually. She watched them move. The port contacts, he said. That's what this is about. Yes. Elena. He said her name the way you'd say the name of a wound. I didn't... The original arrangement was not about your father's network. I want you to know that. What I did 4 years ago was separate from... What did you do 4 years ago? She said. The silence was the longest of the evening, of the week, maybe of the marriage. There was a man, Adrian said, in the Kessler warehouse. Someone Vane had identified as a liability to both of us, to me and to Marcus at the time. Marcus brought me the problem and I solved it. He said this in the register of a man reciting something he'd repeated to himself many times. I didn't know Vane was watching. I didn't know he had documentation. I didn't know until 6 months later when Reeves first made contact. The room was entirely still. Elena sat with what he'd told her, and she looked at her husband's face. The face she'd looked at for 6 years. The face she'd pressed her cheek against and argued with about nursery colors and trusted with the fact of her pregnancy. And she felt something calcify inside her that had been, up until this moment, soft enough to bend. You killed someone, she said. He didn't flinch from it. Yes. In the warehouse you then signed over to the man who has documentation of it. Yes. And Marcus brought you the problem. A different quality of silence. Yes. Marcus. She said the name carefully. Who is the one running the structured exit? Who has been feeding Reyes the information he needs to dismantle everything you've built? Who stood at our wedding and... She stopped herself. How long has Marcus been working with Vane? Adrian looked at her, and she saw it then. The thing that had been building for 3 days behind the compressed jaw and the flat eyes and the 2 days running early returns home. Not just fear, not just the operational stress of a man whose organization was being taken apart, but the specific devastation of a man who had understood something about betrayal that he hadn't been ready to understand. I found out 2 days ago, he said. She stared at him. 2 days ago. Days ago, and you didn't... What was I going to tell you? He said it with a flatness that was not coldness. It was the sound of a man with no good answer. That my oldest friend has been orchestrating the destruction of everything I built? That the reason he has access to do it is because I trusted him with things I shouldn't have? That the man who handed you your wedding bouquet is the one who handed Reyes the keys to the warehouse? Yes, she said. That is exactly what you were going to tell me. He stood up. He moved to the window, his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders, and she thought about the piece of paper in the book in the closet and the 3 names on it, and the reason this had all started, and she said very quietly, Adrian, did you tell Marcus about my father's contacts? The pause before he answered was 4 seconds. She counted them. He asked, Adrian said, still facing the window. 3 years ago. I told him you weren't connected to that world. But I told him you existed, that they existed. I didn't give him names. I didn't give him specifics. He turned. I swear to you I didn't give him the names. But you gave him enough for Vane to know what to look for. He said nothing, which was the answer. She stood up. Her back was aching with the particular low insistence that had been her companion for weeks. But she stood up straight, and she moved to the closet, and she took the book off the shelf again, and she opened it, and she removed the piece of paper with her father's handwriting, and she held it in her hand. This is what they want, she said. All of this. Reyes, the accounts, the structured exit, everything. This is the point of it. These 3 names. My father's port relationships. Vane doesn't need your organization. He needs what my father left me. Adrian looked at the paper in her hand. She watched him understand in real time the geometry of the thing, how it had been constructed, what the target had always been, and the specific role his choices had played in building the path to it. The expression on his face was something she did not have a name for. "Give me that," he said. He crossed the room and reached for the paper. She did not give it to him. "No," she said. He stopped, 2 feet from her, looking at her hand holding the paper and then at her face. "Elena, you don't get to manage this," she said. "You've been managing things for 6 years, and managing things is what brought us to this room, having this conversation. These names are mine. My father gave them to me, not to you, and the fact that Vane knows they exist is your doing, and you don't get to take this from me and handle it." The silence between them was a different kind than any of the silences of the last week. Not the silence of concealment or performance or calculation. The silence of two people in a room with the full truth of a thing and no comfortable place to put it. "Then what?" he said. She folded the paper. She put it in the pocket of her dress, against her hip, and she stood in front of her husband in the bedroom of the penthouse that had been the container of their life together, and she felt the full weight of what he'd done and what she'd missed and what had been built around both of them, without either of them seeing the whole structure until it was nearly complete. "Then we do this my way," she said, "starting now. Elena, you are 33 weeks pregnant. I am aware of what I am." Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, and she didn't soften it. "I am also the person Vane actually wants, which means I am the only leverage in this room that matters. And if you try to move me to the side of this, the way you've been moving me to the side of everything else for 6 years, I will walk out of this penthouse tonight, and you will face Marcus and Vane and Reyes alone, and you know exactly how that ends." He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "What do you need?" he said finally. "I need everything you have on Reyes. Every communication, every document, everything. I need the name of the man who died in the warehouse, because if Vane has documentation, then I need to know what that documentation shows. And I need you to take me to see Marco tonight, right now, because what I'm about to ask him to do cannot wait until morning." "Why Marco?" "Because Marco has been with you for 12 years, and Marcus Hale has not been inside Marco's loyalty structure. And if there is one person in your organization who hasn't been compromised, it is a man who doesn't trust anyone," Marcus introduced. Adrian looked at her. The full look. Nothing held back, and she felt the weight of it differently than she had every other time he'd looked at her this way. Because this time she was looking back with nothing held back either, and what they saw in each other was not comfortable, and was not the marriage they'd been performing, and was in some ways the most honest they'd been in 6 years. "Okay," he said. "One more thing," she said. "What?" "The woman in the study last Tuesday night, the one I saw. I need to know if she was a real affair or a manufactured contact." The pause was short. "Manufactured," he said. "Reyes sent her. She was there to copy documents." "Did she get what she came for?" "I don't know." Elena nodded once. She took her coat from the closet hook and she went to the door of the bedroom, and she stopped with her hand on the frame and she looked back at him. She thought about the last 6 years. All the ways she'd contracted herself into the shape of what he'd needed. All the mornings she'd ironed his shirts and said the right things and looked at the city through the glass and told herself that the life she was living was the life she'd chosen. She thought about the paper in her pocket and her father's handwriting and the 3 names that a dead man had trusted her with because he'd known, even at the end, that she was the one who would know what to do. "Get your jacket," she said. And Hector Vane, who had spent 6 careful months positioning himself to own everything in this room, had made the one miscalculation that his entire operation could not survive. He had looked at Elena Marcelli and seen a wife, and she had just run out of reasons to let him keep looking. Marco Del Vecchio lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in the Callaway district, 12 minutes from the penthouse by car, a fact Elena had catalogued without intending to during a conversation Adrian had with the driver 18 months ago. The building had no doorman, no cameras in the stairwell, and the buzzer system had been broken long enough that Marco had simply given Adrian the door code years back. It was 11:40 when they arrived. Marco opened the door in a gray t-shirt and the particular expression of a man who had been in this kind of work long enough that being woken at midnight by his employer with his employer's pregnant wife did not produce surprise, only a rapid recalibration of the evening's expectations. He looked at Elena first, then at Adrian, then at the way they were standing, not the usual adjacency of a couple, something more parallel, two people oriented toward the same problem. "Come in," he said. The apartment was clean in the functional way of a man who didn't own many things and kept the things he owned where he could find them. A couch, a table, a kitchen that had a coffee maker, and not much else visible. Marco went to the kitchen and started the coffee without being asked, and Elena sat at the table and Adrian stood near the window, and for a moment the three of them existed in the specific quiet of people who were about to say things that couldn't be unsaid. "Marcus Hale," Elena said. Marco set 3 mugs on the counter and turned. His face did the thing she'd been watching it do for 6 years. The controlled flatness that was not absence of reaction, but containment of it. The face of a man who processed before he responded. "Tell me what you know," he said. She told him. All of it. Meridian Consolidated, David Reyes, the structured exit, Luca's extraction, what she'd heard through the study door at Ellery Street. She gave it to him in sequence, efficiently, the way her father had taught her to brief a situation. Facts first, interpretation after, questions at the end. Marco listened without interrupting. He poured the coffee and set the mugs on the table and sat across from her and listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at Adrian. "You knew about Marcus 2 days ago," he said. "Not accusation, just placement of a fact." "Yes," Adrian said, "and you didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." Marco looked at his coffee. He turned the mug once, a small rotation, something to do with his hands while he ran the calculation. "There are 4 people inside the organization who have access to the portside account infrastructure," he said. "I'm one of them. The other 3? One of them has been talking. I've suspected it for 6 weeks, but I didn't have a direction to point the suspicion." "Now you do," Elena said. "Now I do." He looked at her. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to set up a meeting. Reyes? David Reyes. I need him in a room with me, without Adrian, and I need it to look like it comes from me independently, as Dominic Marcelli's daughter, not as Adrian's wife." Marco's expression moved through something Elena didn't have an immediate name for. He looked at her stomach, then at her face, and the look was not dismissive. It was the look of a man calculating variables, including ones he'd been underestimating. "When?" he said. 48 hours, she said, before Vane's end-of-week deadline for the portside accounts. "And what are you offering him?" "A meeting," she said, "with a Marcelli. That's all he needs to know." Marco looked at Adrian. Adrian said nothing. This, Elena noted, was new. The silence of a man who had, for the first time in their marriage, understood that speaking would reduce rather than add to what was being built. "I'll make contact by morning," Marco said. They drove back to the penthouse in the same parallel silence. Adrian's hand rested on the seat between them, not quite touching hers. She was aware of it the whole 12 minutes. Inside, he went to get water, and she went to the bedroom, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she let herself have 45 seconds. Just 45, she counted them, of the full weight of what the night had produced. The warehouse. The man who'd died in it. Her father's contacts used as bait in a trap that had been building for 4 years while she made dinner and went to doctor's appointments and argued about nursery colors. The paper in her pocket, which she now removed and looked at, her father's handwriting, the 3 names, the specific intimacy of recognizing a dead man's cursive at midnight in a room that had stopped feeling safe. 45 seconds. Then she stood up and went to the desk in the corner of the bedroom. Her desk, the one she used for her own correspondence, which Adrian had never opened because he'd never had reason to think it contained anything worth opening. And she wrote down everything she knew in a precise and sequential document that took her 40 minutes to complete. She sealed it in an envelope and addressed it to Pia and put it in her coat pocket to mail in the morning from a box 3 blocks from the building, because she needed a copy of the full picture to exist somewhere outside the penthouse. Adrian was asleep when she came to bed, or performing sleep with the same quality she'd been performing things for a week. She lay beside him and looked at the ceiling and thought about David Reyes, and what he would say when Marco's contact reached him, and what she needed him to believe long enough to use. She slept 2 hours, maybe 3. Marco called at 7:42. "He'll meet," Marco said. "Tomorrow night. He wants the Aldrich Hotel, the bar on the 4th floor. He wants to come alone." "Fine," Elena said. "Elena." Marco's voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. "Reyes is not..." He is not a man who sits down with people he thinks are a liability. The fact that he agreed to this meeting means he wants the Marcelli contacts badly enough to take the risk of a face-to-face. That makes him dangerous in a specific way. I know. I need to be in that bar. You can be in the bar, she said. You can't be at the table. A pause. Agreed. She ended the call and stood in the kitchen with her coffee, and she thought about the Aldrich Hotel's fourth-floor bar, which she'd been to twice, and she thought about what she needed to accomplish in the next 36 hours, and she began making a list in her head that was not a list she wrote down anywhere. The first item on that list was Marcus Hale. But she called him from her regular phone at 9 in the morning. She called him the way she'd called him dozens of times over 5 years. The easy familiarity of a woman calling her husband's oldest friend, warm but not effusive, the practiced social tone of their particular relationship. Elena. Marcus picked up on the second ring. How are you feeling? Diane said you looked tired last night. I'm fine, the third trimester. She let the small laugh come naturally. I actually wanted to ask you something, and I hope it's not overstepping. Of course. What do you need? I've been thinking about the property in the Kessler district, the warehouse. Adrian mentioned it's been tied up in some kind of transfer issue, and I know it's his business, but my father used to use that facility, and it has, I don't know, sentimental value sounds absurd, but the pause on Marcus's end was very small. She would have missed it 6 months ago. I don't know much about the day-to-day of those arrangements, Elena. That's really Adrian's territory. I know. I just thought since you and Adrian handle so much together, you might know who to talk to. Someone named Reyes was mentioned. I might have misheard. This pause was longer. She held the phone and breathed and counted. I don't know anyone by that name, Marcus said. Easy, smooth, 6 years of friendship in the tone of it. I must have misheard, she said. Never mind. Thank you, Marcus. Of course, take care of yourself. She ended the call and put the phone face down on the counter. In the next 60 seconds, Marcus Hale was going to call David Reyes and tell him that Elena Marcelli Voss had just spoken that name directly to him, and Reyes was going to understand that she was either a variable or an asset, and he was going to decide, because this was the specific psychology she was counting on, that the meeting tomorrow night had just become significantly more important. She had just made herself impossible to ignore. She had also, she understood clearly, made herself a target. The next 30 hours had a quality she would later remember as compressed. Time moving at 2 speeds simultaneously, the slow drag of waiting and the sudden violent acceleration of things happening that couldn't be controlled. Adrian gave her the documents on Reyes that evening. He laid them on the kitchen table with the expression of a man setting down a weapon he'd been carrying too long, and she went through them methodically while he stood at the window and didn't pretend to be doing anything else. The communications were cautious, Reyes was careful, everything oblique, the kind of language that had plausible alternative readings. But taken together with what she already knew, they assembled into a clear picture of the transfer architecture and the timeline and the specific mechanism Vane intended to use once the portside accounts were in position. She found the name of the man who died in the Kessler warehouse on the 4th page of a document that wasn't supposed to contain it. A scan of a handwritten note, Adrian's handwriting, from 4 years ago, the kind of note a man wrote for himself when he was trying to work out the details of something and then forgot to destroy. The name was Owen Garth. She wrote it separately and set it aside and did not say anything about it to Adrian because what she was building required that specific name and she was not ready to explain why yet. The meeting tomorrow, Adrian said. I should be there. No, she said, without looking up from the documents. Elena, if you're there, it's a confrontation. He brings security, everyone escalates, and we get nothing. If I'm there alone, I'm a pregnant woman who wants to talk about her father's legacy. He underestimates me. She looked up. Everyone does. That's the last useful thing your management of this situation has produced, and I'm not throwing it away by putting you in the room. He looked at her for a long moment. If something goes wrong, Marco will be there. Marco is one man. Marco is enough. She returned to the documents. Go to sleep. You look like you haven't in 3 days. He hadn't. She knew because she'd been watching him not sleep from 2 feet away. He didn't go to sleep, but he stopped arguing. 1. The Aldrich Hotel's 4th-floor bar was the kind of place that understood discretion as a business model. Low light, separate tables, staff who looked at their shoes when prominent people had conversations they didn't want witnessed. Elena arrived at 8:15, 15 minutes before the agreed time, and chose the table in the far corner with her back to the wall and a sight line to the entrance, and she ordered sparkling water and sat and let her breathing settle. She was 33 weeks and 2 days pregnant. Her back had been in active protest since noon. Her feet were swollen enough that she'd had to choose shoes carefully, and the walk from the hotel entrance had produced a low, persistent ache in her hips that she was going to ignore for the duration of this conversation. Marco was at the bar. She'd seen him when she came in, already in position, a man having a quiet drink alone, which was a thing Marco could perform without effort. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. David Reyes arrived at 8:28. She knew him immediately. Not from the physical description Pia had given her, but from the way he moved through the bar, the controlled scan of the room before he committed to entering it, the deliberate placement of every step. 41, medium height, the kind of compact stillness that certain men developed when they'd spent a lot of time in rooms where reading exits was a survival skill. He wore a dark jacket, no tie, the careful anonymity of someone who'd thought about what not to stand out in. He found her table and he stopped, looked at her. She watched him do the calculation, the pregnancy, the corner table, the specific stillness of a woman who was not performing nervousness, and she watched him decide in real time what category to put her in. He sat down. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Ms. Marcelli," she said. "In this context," a fractional adjustment in his expression. He ordered water from the server without looking away from her. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I said I would." "People say a lot of things." "I know," she said. "You've been listening to my husband say them for 4 months." He was quiet for a moment, assessing. She let him assess. "You called Marcus Hale yesterday," he said. "I did." That was a message. "It was," she said. "I wanted you to know that I understand the shape of what you're doing and that I'm not a peripheral figure in it. I'm the center of it." He looked at her, the real look, the one men like him used when they were done performing engagement and wanted actual information. "What do you want?" "The same thing my father always wanted," she said. "For the people with access to his network to be people he chose. He didn't choose Hector Vane. He didn't choose you. He chose me." She let that sit. "What you've been building assumes that once Adrian's organization collapses, the Marcelli port contacts transfer by default. They don't. They're not a corporate asset. They're personal relationships that exist because of my father's name, and without my direct endorsement, they are 3 names on a piece of paper that no one returns calls for." Reyes was still. Very still, the way trained men went still when something recalibrated. "What are you offering?" he said. "I'm not offering anything yet," she said. "I'm telling you the terms of any offer that will ever come from me." First term. Vane withdraws from the portside account deadline. The structured exit stops where it is. Second term. The documentation from the Kessler warehouse, Owen Garth, is destroyed and the copies are verified destroyed in my presence. Third term. Marcus Hale is removed from any further involvement in my husband's business or mine. She paused. "In exchange for those 3 things, I will have a conversation with Vane, a real one, about what a working relationship with the Marcelli network actually looks like." Reyes looked at her for a long time. "You're trying to buy time," he said. "I'm trying to establish terms," she said. "There's a difference. You've had a week to build whatever you've built. You went to Marco Del Vecchio. You talked to your cousin Pia. He said Pia's name the way you'd put a card on a table, face up, deliberate. You've been constructing something. I want to know what." The mention of Pia's name went through her like ice water, and she did not let a single degree of it show on her face. She held his gaze and she said, "I've been doing what anyone does when they find out their house is built on someone else's foundation. I've been getting a full picture of the foundation. And now that you have it? Now I'm at this table." He leaned back. The slight change in posture, not relaxation, recalibration. She watched him work through what she'd said and what she hadn't said and what the gap between them implied. "I'll take your terms to Vane," he said. "I can't speak for him." "I know you can't," she said, "but I think you'll present them accurately because you understand that if you don't, the next conversation won't be between me and Vane. It'll be between me and the 3 men my father trusted, and I'll tell them a very different kind of story." The bar was quiet around them. Low music, low light, Marco at the bar, with his drink and his patience. Reyes looked at her one more time, the full assessment, the complete one, and she saw him arrive at a conclusion that was not what he'd expected to arrive at when he'd agreed to this meeting. 24 hours, he said. 24 hours, she agreed. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the bar the way he'd come in. Controlled, deliberate, giving nothing to the room. She watched him go, and then she sat with her water and her aching back and her 33 weeks, and she breathed. Marco materialized at her table 3 minutes after Reyes left, sliding into the chair across from her, and he looked at her face and he said nothing for a moment. He mentioned Pia, she said. I heard, Marco said quietly. He'd been close enough. They've been watching your contacts. Since when? Long enough. He put both hands on the table, flat, a grounding gesture. Elena, if Vane has been watching Pia's communications, I know, she said. I need you to get to Pia before anyone else does. Tonight. Right now. She met his eyes. She may not be safe. Marco was already standing. He put money on the table for his drink, the automatic courtesy of a careful man, and he looked at her. And you? I'm calling Adrian, she said. And then I'm going to sit here for 5 minutes because if I stand up right now, my back is going to buckle, and I would prefer that not happen in public. Marco almost smiled. Not quite. 5 minutes, he said. 5 minutes. He left. She sat in the low-lit bar of the Aldrich Hotel, and she pressed her hand against her lower back, and she looked at the empty chair across from her where David Reyes had sat, and she thought about 24 hours and what Vane would do with her terms, and whether the structure she'd built in a week was solid enough to hold the weight she was about to put on it. Her phone buzzed. Adrian. She picked up. I'm fine, she said before he could speak. Marco called me. I know, I told him to. Pia. Marco's going to her now. She'll be fine. She said it with more certainty than she had, because certainty was what the next 24 hours required, and she was going to manufacture it if she couldn't feel it. Elena. His voice had the stripped quality of a man who'd run out of the particular pride that usually shaped how he spoke to her. What did you give him? Terms, she said. Vane has 24 hours to respond. And if he doesn't accept, she looked at the empty chair. She thought about the piece of paper that was no longer in her pocket. She'd photographed it that morning and burned the original in the kitchen sink and given the photograph to Marco to hold because the physical paper was no longer an asset. It was a liability. It was a thing that could be taken from her. And she thought about her father's handwriting, the 3 names, the specific weight of inheriting something from a dead man who'd trusted you with it. If he doesn't accept, she said, then the 3 men my father trusted are going to receive a package tomorrow morning that contains a complete documented account of Hector Vane's structured exit operation, Owen Garth's name, Marcus Hale's involvement, and a clear picture of who has been dismantling the network that keeps their own operations stable. She paused. Vane will lose the port access permanently, and Marcus will not survive what comes after that in any meaningful professional sense. The silence on the phone had a texture to it. You built a dead man's switch, Adrian said. I built a dead man's switch, she confirmed. When? 2 days ago, while you were sleeping. Another silence. Longer. Elena, I'm coming home, she said. I need to sit down properly and eat something and put my feet up, and tomorrow we're going to find out what Vane decides, and we're going to handle whatever he decides. But right now I need to eat and sit down, and I would like you to be there when I do. She heard him exhale. It was the sound of something releasing that had been held for a very long time. I'll be here, he said. She ended the call. She sat for 1 more minute in the quiet of the bar, her hand on her stomach, the baby moving with that purposeful rolling motion that had become the constant background of her days. She thought about what was coming in the next 24 hours, and she thought about what came after that. The resolution, the reckoning, the specific work of dismantling what Marcus had built and containing what Vane thought he held, and finding a way to the other side of it with the child and the man and the version of herself that had woken up in a doorway a week ago. She was not afraid. She was something harder than afraid, and more useful, and she stood up slowly with one hand on the table's edge and her jaw set against the ache in her back. And she walked out of the Aldrich Hotel's 4th-floor bar with her head straight and her face giving nothing to the room, and in the elevator going down she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything, just for those 30 seconds of descent, just for the closed space of the cab and the hum of the cable, and then the doors opened into the lobby, and she walked out into the city night, and she did not look like a woman who had just put everything she had on a table and was waiting to see if it held. She looked like a woman who already knew. Somewhere across the city, Hector Vane was reading David Reyes's report of a conversation he hadn't anticipated, and in the next 24 hours he was going to make a decision that would determine whether Elena Marcelli's architecture was strong enough to hold him. And in the back of a car heading uptown, with Marco already at Pia's door and Adrian waiting in the penthouse, and the names of 3 men her father had trusted encrypted on Marco's phone, the last piece was already in motion, the one none of them had seen yet, the one that was going to make the next 12 hours the most dangerous of everything that had come before. The call came at 4 a.m. Not from Vane, not from Reyes, from Pia. Elena was awake when it came. She'd been awake since 2, lying in the dark with Adrian asleep beside her, running the variables the way she'd been running them for a week. The same circuit, the same nodes, checking the structure of what she'd built for weaknesses she might have missed. The burner buzzed on the nightstand and she had it in her hand before the second vibration. Marco got it here an hour ago, Pia said. Her voice was flat in a way that was different from her usual flatness, thinner, a wire pulled tight. There were 2 men outside the building when he arrived. He handled it. But Elena, are you hurt? No, I'm fine. Marco is... A sound in the background, movement. He's fine too. But they weren't here for documents. They weren't here to look for anything. A pause that carried weight. They were here for me specifically. Marco said the way they were positioned. I understand, Elena said. She was already sitting up. The bedroom was dark and Adrian stirred beside her, coming out of sleep with the immediate alertness of a man trained to it. Vane didn't wait for morning, Elena said to him. Not a question. He sat up, read her face. Where? Pia's. She was already moving, feet on the floor, reaching for the lamp. Marco handled it, but Vane just answered my terms. Adrian's jaw set. He rejected them. He sent people to my cousin at 3 in the morning, she said. What do you think? She called Marco from the burner. He picked up on the first ring. I need 30 minutes, she said. I know what you need, Marco said. I already called them. Who? The 3 names. The numbers you gave me on the photograph. His voice had the compressed efficiency of a man operating in an emergency with full competence. I told them Elena Marcelli needed 20 minutes of their time before sunrise. All 3 said yes. She stood in the bedroom of the penthouse with the lamp on, and the city still dark outside the glass, and she felt something in her chest that was not relief and was not victory. It was the sensation of a structure she'd built under pressure being tested for the first time, the specific suspense of not yet knowing if it would hold. Where? She said. Callahan's. The private room. You know it? She knew it. Her father had taken her there once, when she was 19, to show her what a certain kind of conversation looked like when it was conducted properly. The private room at the back of Callahan's on Meridian Street, where the table was round because her father had believed that round tables produced better outcomes than rectangular ones, where the lighting was what it was and the food didn't matter, and the only thing that happened was talk. I'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. Elena. Marco's voice shifted. All 3 of them are going to want to know why a pregnant woman is calling them at 4 in the morning. They said yes because of your father's name. You need to make sure what you say is worth the name. I know, she said. She ended the call. She went to this closet and she dressed. Not the charcoal, not anything that was about performance. Dark pants, a loose top that accommodated the pregnancy without statement, flat shoes. She brushed her hair and pulled it back and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, not checking, just looking. The tiredness around her eyes, the specific gravity of 33 weeks in her face. And she thought, this is what it looks like to finish something. Adrian was dressed when she came out. She looked at him. You're not coming, she said. I know, he said. I know I'm not coming. The acknowledgement was so clean and so unlike the man she'd spent 6 years managing around that she stood still for a moment and just looked at him. He looked back at her without the calculation, without the controlled flatness, without any of the architecture of concealment. He looked like someone who had put something down. The documentation on Owen Garth, she said. I need you to pull whatever you have and bring it to Marco by 6 a.m. Everything. Not the version you'd show someone you were trying to manage. Everything. He didn't flinch. Okay. Because what I'm going to tell those three men needs to be the complete truth. And the complete truth includes what happened in that warehouse. And I need to be able to verify what I'm saying when I say it. I understand. Adrian. She stood at the bedroom door, her coat in her hand. If this works, and I believe it will work, the outcome is not going to look like what you had before. The organization will look different. The relationships will be different. Some of what you built is already gone, and the rest of it is going to change shape. She held his gaze. You need to be able to accept that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what does it look like? After. She thought about it honestly. Smaller, she said. Cleaner. Less of it underground. Some of it legitimate in ways it currently isn't. She paused. A life our child could grow up inside without inheriting what we're dealing with right now. He sat down on the edge of the bed. It was a small collapse. Not dramatic, not broken, just the physical acknowledgement of a man who had run for a long time and had stopped. And us, he said. I don't know yet, she said. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I won't promise you something at 4 in the morning that I can't verify in daylight. She put on her coat. Have the documents to Marco by 6. I'll call you when it's done. She left him sitting on the edge of the bed in the lamplight, and she did not look back because looking back was not something she could afford until this was finished. The three men at Callahan's were older than she'd expected them to be, or perhaps she'd built them larger in her imagination over the years, and the actual men were simply what they were. Sal Donato, 68, who had run the cold storage contracts at Port Lawrence for 22 years and who had the specific density of a man whose physical life was mostly behind him, but whose organizational intelligence was not. Felix Crane, 59, the South Dock coordinator, compact and precise with watchful eyes, and a coffee he didn't drink. And Raymond Chu, 64, who managed the bonded warehouse network, and who had known her father since before Elena was born, and who looked at her when she walked into the private room with an expression that contained grief and recognition in equal measure. Dominic's girl, Raymond said. Dominic's daughter, she said. Yes. She sat. She did not apologize for the hour. She did not preamble. She told them, in the same sequential factual register she'd used with Marco 2 nights ago, what Hector Vane had been building, the structured exit, the port access as the actual target, the use of her father's name as leverage in a game none of them had known was being played. She told them about David Reyes and Meridian Consolidated and the warehouse in the Kessler district. She told them about the 2 men outside Pia's building at 3 in the morning. She told them about Owen Garth. Briefly, without detail beyond what was necessary, because what was necessary was that they understood the shape of the leverage and not that they understood every dimension of her husband's history with it. They listened. Sal Donato turned his coffee cup. Felix Crane did not move. Raymond Chu looked at her face throughout with the expression of a man verifying something he'd suspected. When she finished, Sal spoke first. You're telling us Vane wants the port relationships your father built? Yes. Through you, via your husband's collapsed organization. That's the structure he built, yes. And what you want from us, Sal looked at the other two, a brief triangulation, is a unified response that makes the port access non-transferable without your direct endorsement. What I want, Elena said, is for the 3 of you to make a single call, today, before business hours, to Vane's known contact point. Not to negotiate, to inform. To tell him that any approach to the Marcelli network, now or in the future, goes through Dominic Marcelli's daughter, and that Dominic Marcelli's daughter has already declined the approach, and that any further pressure applied to her family or her associates will result in a complete restructuring of port relationships that will cost Vane the access he already has through other channels. The room was quiet. Felix Crane spoke for the first time. You're using us as a wall. I'm using you as what you are, she said. The people my father trusted. The people Vane wants and can't have without your cooperation. That cooperation is the wall. She looked at Felix directly. I'm not asking you to do anything you wouldn't do for my father. I'm asking you to do what you'd do if Dominic were sitting here instead of me. Raymond Chu looked at her for a long moment. Your father, he said, would have handled this differently. My father, she said, is not here. A silence that was not uncomfortable. Raymond nodded once, a small movement, the specific economy of a man who had said what needed saying and heard what needed hearing. We'll make the call, Raymond said. All three of us, this morning. He looked at the other two. They didn't disagree. But Elena. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table. After this is done, the arrangement, what it looks like going forward. Clean, she said. Whatever it is, it has to be clean enough that my child doesn't inherit a war. Raymond looked at her stomach. He looked at her face. He looked at something behind her face that she couldn't see but could feel him looking at. And whatever he found there appeared to satisfy a question he hadn't asked aloud. Your father would be proud of you, he said. She let the words land, and she did not perform modesty about them. She nodded once, and she said, Thank you for coming. And she meant it in the complete way, and she stood and she walked out of the private room at the back of Callahan's on Meridian Street and into the pre-dawn of the city. And she stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and she breathed. The call to Vane's contact was made at 7:43 in the morning, while Elena sat in the kitchen of the penthouse with coffee. She was only partly drinking, and Adrian sat across from her with the documents he'd retrieved. Everything. She could tell by the weight of the envelope and the look on his face when he gave it to her. Everything. The version without management. Marco called her at 8:05. It's done, he said. Reyes acknowledged receipt of the message. No response yet from Vane directly, but Reyes... A pause. He folded. He told me the portside deadline is withdrawn. He said, and I want to be accurate here, that Vane considers the matter concluded. Elena set her coffee cup down with both hands. The Owen Garth documentation. Reyes says it will be surrendered. He wants to do it directly to you, not through intermediaries. He suggested this afternoon. She looked at Adrian across the table. He was reading her face the way he'd always read her face, except that now she knew he was reading it, and she didn't adjust for him. She let him see what was there. Set it up, she said to Marco. Not the Aldrich, somewhere neutral, public enough that he can't maneuver. The Hargrove lobby, Marco said. Coffee level. Open, visible, no private rooms. Fine, she ended the call. It's working, Adrian said. Not a question. The evidence was in her face. It's working, she said. He exhaled. Something in his shoulders released that she didn't think he'd been aware he was holding. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she let it sit there, the warmth of it, the familiar weight of it. And she looked at their hands and thought about the 6 years the hands had been in this kitchen, and all the mornings, and all the things said and not said, and the child who was coming, and the specific arithmetic of what you kept and what you let go when the accounting was finally done. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked up. The reason I married you. He said it without the smoothness he usually brought to difficult things, the words coming out with the texture of something unpolished. I want you to know, it wasn't only the port contacts. I want you to know that because I know what you've been thinking, what you worked out about how I chose you, and I need you to know it wasn't only that. She looked at him steadily. But it was partly that, she said. A beat. Yes, he said. In the beginning, it was partly that. She nodded. She turned her hand over under his so they were palm to palm, a different kind of contact than the one he'd initiated. I know, she said. I've known for 3 days. I've been deciding what to do with it for 3 days. And I'm still here, she said. That's all I know right now. I'm still here and the baby is coming in 6 weeks, and we are going to deal with what's directly in front of us. And after that, she paused. After that, we figure out if there's an after that. He closed his hand around hers. She let him. David Reyes surrendered the documentation at 2:17 in the afternoon at a table in the Hargrove lobby, with Marco standing 12 feet away at the coffee bar and the ordinary movement of a hotel lobby flowing around them, like the documentation of everything normal that existed outside their specific gravity. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. She opened it, inspected the contents, the scan of the Kessler warehouse records, the photographs, the written account that had been Vane's primary instrument for 4 months, and she looked at Reyes and she said, copies. None remaining, he said. I don't believe you. You don't have to believe me, he said. I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him. The compact stillness, the controlled face, the man who had spent 6 months systematically dismantling a life from the inside. And she said, "Who commissioned the operation originally, Vane or Marcus Hale?" A silence. "Marcus came to Vane," Reyes said. "The documentation on Garth came from Marcus. He'd been holding it for 4 years." The cold moved through her again, the same cold as the hallway outside the study on Ellery Street, and she held it, and she let it move through, and she said, "Marcus has been holding documentation of something my husband did for 4 years, waiting for the right moment to use it." "Yes." And the right moment was when Vane identified the Marcelli port access as the actual leverage point. "Yes." She put the envelope in her bag. She looked at Reyes one more time. "I don't expect to see you again." "You won't," he said. It sounded true. She stood. She walked to Marco and they left the hotel together, and outside on the sidewalk, the afternoon was gray and cold and ordinary, and she stood for a moment with her hand pressed to the side of her stomach where the baby was moving, insistent, the way the baby had been moving all day as if tracking the trajectory of things. And Marco stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly what the moment needed. "Marcus," she said finally. "I know," Marco said. "Adrian needs to handle that himself." She looked at the street. "I won't do it for him, but I need it handled." "It will be," Marco said. And the way he said it told her that certain things were already in motion that she didn't need the full detail of, which was its own kind of relief. Marcus Hale resigned from every board, every advisory position, every formal connection to Adrian's operation 10 days later. He and Diane listed the townhouse on Ellery Street 3 weeks after that. Elena heard through the ordinary channels of the city's social network that they were relocating, somewhere west, somewhere that was not this city, somewhere that the name Marcus Hale would not carry the specific weight it had carried here. She did not think about Marcus Hale more than she had to. The anger was real, and it was hers, and she carried it, but she carried it the way you carried something that would reduce over time rather than something you cultivated. Her father had taught her that sustained anger was a resource expenditure with diminishing returns, and her father had been right about most things, and she intended to let this one be right too. The Owen Garth documentation, the original, and the one copy that Reyes had lied about having, which Marco located and retrieved through methods she didn't ask about, she held for 2 weeks. She thought about what it meant to hold it, and what it meant to destroy it, and what it meant to keep it. In the end, she destroyed it, because what it documented was a thing she could not undo and could not use and could not look at without feeling the specific weight of being married to someone who had done it, and that weight was going to be with her regardless of whether the paper existed. She told Adrian she'd destroyed it. He said thank you, and she said don't thank me, and he understood the difference. The baby came 5 days before the due date, on a Thursday morning, with a speed that surprised Dr. Harmon and did not entirely surprise Elena, who had spent the last 3 weeks with the feeling that the child was impatient, had always been impatient, had been waiting inside the storm of the last month with the same quality of restrained readiness that Elena had been practicing her whole life. 6 hours of labor. Adrian in the room, she'd decided that, had made the decision quietly without drama, had told him 2 weeks before that she wanted him there, and had watched his face do the thing that was not the controlled flatness, and not the calculation, but the third thing, the unguarded thing. And he held her hand through the worst of it without saying anything useless, which was the most useful thing he could have done. The baby was a girl. Elena held her in the gray morning light of the hospital room and looked at her face, red and furious and absolutely present, the way new people were present, completely and without apology. And she felt something settle in the center of her chest that had not been settled for a very long time. Not peace exactly. Something more earned than peace. The specific stillness of a woman who had walked through a burning building and come out the other side holding something intact. Adrian sat beside the bed. He looked at the baby with the expression she'd seen flicker across his face that night in the kitchen 6 weeks ago, the unguarded one, the one that had no architecture to it. And she thought about what it meant to see a man's face do that and still be uncertain about everything else. And she thought that uncertainty was probably the honest place to be. "What do you want to name her?" he said. She'd been thinking about it for days, had a list she'd never written down, had carried it in her head, the way she'd carried most things that mattered. "Mara," she said, "after my mother." He looked at her. I didn't know your mother's name. I know, she said. There's a lot you didn't know about me. She looked down at the baby, at Mara, who had stopped the furious squinting and was now doing the particular stillness of a newborn orienting to the world. We have time to fix that, if that's what we decide to do. He put his hand over hers on the edge of the blanket, the same gesture as at the kitchen table, and she looked at their hands and at the baby between them, and she made no promises she couldn't verify in daylight. 3 months later, on a morning in early spring when the city was doing the tentative thing it did in March, the gray retreating slightly, the light changing quality without quite committing to warmth, Elena sat at the kitchen island with Mara in the carrier against her chest and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and a legal document open on the counter. The document was the restructuring of Voss Capital LLC. Adrian's attorneys had spent 6 weeks on it. The legitimate holdings, the real estate, the investment vehicles, the import infrastructure that had always been clean, were separated formally and finally from the underground architecture. The underground architecture was being dissolved, not transferred, not restructured, not rebranded, dissolved. It was slow work, and it was not without cost, and there were relationships that did not survive the transition, and losses that were real and not easy to account for. Adrian had done it without being asked. He told her about it on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after Mara was born, sitting across from her with a quiet directness that was different from the controlled presentations of their old life. And she'd listened and asked 2 specific questions about the mechanics and nodded and said, "Good." She sat now with Mara breathing against her chest and the legal document in front of her and the spring light coming through the glass, and she thought about her father, who had never had the option of dissolution, who had built what he'd built in a world that didn't offer the kind of exit she was watching Adrian take. She thought about the 3 names, Sal Donato, Felix Crane, Raymond Chu, who had made a single phone call on a cold February morning and had changed the shape of everything. And she thought about Raymond's face when he'd said your father would be proud of you, and she let herself feel that rather than filing it away. Mara shifted against her chest. A small adjustment, the breathing of a person who had been in the world for 3 months and was still working out the basic terms of it. I know, Elena said quietly, to the top of her daughter's head. I know. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the city through the glass, the same view, the same neon and traffic and compressed ordinary life of it. And she thought about the night she'd stood at this window and felt the storm building before she'd known what the storm was. And she thought about the doorway and the 3-inch gap and the amber light and the choice she'd made to stand still and look rather than to push the door open. That choice had cost her something. The week that followed, it had cost her more. She was still counting the cost in ways that didn't always show on her face and probably wouldn't stop for a long time. But Mara was breathing against her chest. The legal document on the counter was real. The city was doing what it always did, grinding away at itself, indifferent, ongoing. And she was still in it, still standing. The weight of everything she'd carried through the last 2 months distributed differently now, not lighter exactly, but better balanced. The way a load shifted so you could walk with it rather than be bent by it. She heard Adrian in the hallway, his step, the specific rhythm of it she'd mapped without meaning to over 6 years. He came into the kitchen and looked at her and looked at Mara and went to the coffee maker, and the ordinariness of it was both simple and not simple at all. The attorney's called, he said. The last transfer clears on Friday. Okay, she said. He poured his coffee and came to stand beside her at the island, looking at the document. After Friday, he said, it's done. After Friday, she agreed, it's done. He looked at Mara. The baby had opened her eyes, dark, still working out focus, the searching gaze of a person trying to locate things. And Adrian put one finger against her hand and Mara's fingers closed around it the way they always did, the reflexive grip that had no knowledge of what it was gripping but held on anyway. He stayed like that for a moment, his finger in his daughter's hand, and Elena watched the side of his face, and she thought about trust, not the word, but the actual thing, the substance of it, what it was made of when it was real, and what it looked like when it was rebuilt from rubble rather than assumed from the beginning. She thought it probably looked like this: a man standing in a kitchen at 8 in the morning, connected to a small person by one finger, in a life that was smaller and cleaner than the one he'd burned down, trying to be worth what was still being offered. She didn't know, yet, if he was. She thought she would know over time. She thought that was the honest answer. And she had decided, somewhere in the 6 weeks since Mara arrived, that honest answers were the only ones she was going to carry going forward. The performed answers, the managed presentations, the carefully constructed faces she'd built for rooms full of people who were looking past her anyway, she was done with those. They had cost her too much for too long, and the ledger was clear now, and she was not interested in opening it again. Mara released Adrian's finger. He straightened. He looked at Elena. "I'm going to be late," he said. "I know," she said. He kissed her. On the temple, a careful thing, the kind of gesture that asked nothing and offered something. And he picked up his jacket and his coffee, and he left, and she heard the elevator engage, and then the penthouse was quiet in the ordinary morning way of it, and Mara breathed against her chest, and the city moved through the glass, and Elena Marcelli sat with her coffee going cold, and her daughter against her heart, and the spring light doing its tentative work on the gray. And she was not who she'd been when the storm started. She was someone the storm had made. The same woman, in the way that things were the same after they'd been through enough heat, recognizable in the essential shape, different in every surface quality, harder in the places that needed to be harder, some places she hadn't expected, softer than before. The city below did not know her name. It had not watched what she'd done, or understood what it had cost, or witnessed the particular quality of strength it had required to stand in a doorway at midnight and choose to look rather than to break. That was fine. She had not done it to be known by the city. She had done it for the person breathing against her chest, who would one day live in that city, who would need a world with cleaner edges than the one her parents had almost failed to build her, and who was right now, in the particular grace of 3 months, entirely unaware of any of it. Elena pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. She held them there. Outside, the spring light came through the glass and fell across the kitchen floor, pale and real and unconditional, the way light always was, indifferent to what the room had held before it arrived, interested only in what was there now.